Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining me today for episode 777 of People Behind the Science. Today, we are rebroadcasting our interview with our guest, Dr. Jamie Voyles. Listeners, research in Jamie's lab focuses on diseases and conservation of wildlife. This is an exciting area of research that spans a lot of different subdisciplines of biology, including immunology, physiology, microbiology, ecology, and evolutionary biology. And in our interview, Jamie talks more about her research as well as her life outside the lab. So I hope you enjoy this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People Behind the Science. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by the wonderful Dr. Jamie Voyles. So, Jamie, thanks so much for joining us. How are you today?
Thanks. I'm great. It's wonderful to be here.
Well, we are delighted to have you and looking forward to hearing more about your life in science. But before we jump into all the details, I do want to take a moment to introduce you to our listeners. So, listeners, Jamie is an assistant professor of biology at the University of Nevada, Reno. She received her bachelor's degree in Zoology and Anthropology from the University of Washington, her master's degree in Integrative Physiology from the University of Colorado Boulder, and her Ph.D. in Public Health from James Cook University in Australia. Afterwards, Jamie conducted postdoctoral research at the University of Idaho and at UC Berkeley before accepting her current position. And she is here with us today, listeners, to talk about her life and her science. So, Jamie, we'd love to talk about life first. So can you start by telling us what you like to do when you're not very hard at work?
Absolutely. I live very close to some spectacular mountains. And one of my favorite things to do is to head out into the hills with my skis or to go rock climbing or mountain biking frequently with my beloved dog. And generally when we're getting from one place to the other, we like to get there in my VW Westfalia camper van, which provides some adventures on the side as well.
That's awesome. Well, I'm a crazy dog person myself. So tell us about your little dog.
My dog is actually still a puppy at the moment, only 6 months old.
Aww.
His name is Ptarmigan, like the bird, and we call him Targi for short. And he's been to puppy school and graduated from puppy kindergarten, but he's still a little iffy on a few of the commands we're working on.
It takes a couple of years, I think, for them to sink in. No worries there.
Yeah.
Well, Jamie, great to hear a little bit more about your life outside of science, but I would love to chat about your work next. I know you've got some cool work going on, but maybe for people who aren't familiar with your research specifically or your field, how do you describe it?
Sure. So frequently how I describe my work kind of depends on who I'm talking to. Generally, if they're wildlife enthusiasts, I like to explain that I work on diseases of wildlife. So that usually entails a wide range of subdisciplines within biology. So sometimes I'm wearing a immunologist physiology hat, and sometimes I will switch that up and talk about the microbiology that I do that involves our work with the pathogen. But then at heart, I'm also very much an ecologist and a scientist who's very interested in evolutionary biology. So one of the reasons why this area of study is so exciting for me is it really does scale across multiple biological disciplines. And that's something that I find particularly thrilling about working in this field.
Definitely. And I think the work that you do can be so exciting and enough to kind of get you out of bed and thrilled to go into work every day. But for everyone out there, that may not be the case. So for anyone out there who's looking for some motivation or inspiration, is there maybe a motivational quote or a saying or a motivational force that really inspires you or keeps you going in your work?
Probably the most basic one is never give up. It's quite simple and very straightforward, and it's absolutely the truth.
I love it. So Jamie, for you in your own experiences, were there moments where you struggled with this, where you were feeling like you wanted to give up on science?
Yes, there have been countless moments where it feels like the challenges are insurmountable. However, I think that basically requires taking a step back, reevaluating, maybe doing something else, something different for a little while, and suddenly your perspective shifts and you come back to the problem. And frequently that tends to be one of the most successful ways to deal with that particular problem.
Definitely. Take a step back before you can dive back into the problem and just continue being persistent, I think is a great message for our listeners out there. So we talked a little about what motivates you, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about who motivates you next. I think as a scientist, you meet a lot of wonderful people and you've got a lot of role models. So is there one particular person or maybe a few people that really rise to the top in your mind as having a big impact on you in your career?
Well, unquestionably, my students are a lot of the reason why I keep coming back to this job. Mm-hmm. So I think that there is a tremendous amount of inspiration that I really use to get me motivated. And it comes from just the excitement of students and young scientists who are interested and enthusiastic and exploring different ideas that they have. And I'm also pretty excited about some of the locations where I work in the field. Frequently, we're working in pretty remote locations, and some of the families and children that I work with in some of those areas, it's been quite remarkable to watch them grow up and learn about the animals that we work with and see them develop their own ideas and thoughts about what the world is now and what it could be in the future.
I love it. And Jamie, I think you touched on a really cool part of your job that you have this element of outreach and education in general for the public about wildlife conservation and some of the work that you do. So maybe can you speak a little bit about what it's like being able to go out and teach people?
So one of the areas that we work is in some remote communities in Panama, and the particular areas where we work, there was sort of a limited understanding of, for example, like the value of amphibians within that region. One thing that has been really exciting is that the Panamanian national animal is actually the golden frog. And yet there was still sort of misunderstanding or a lack of understanding about what amphibians are in general, what their basic biology is, and why they're important for the bigger ecosystem. So we have, over the course of about 10 years, really built a huge community outreach project that involves young children all the way up to teachers and the communities where they work, bringing together lots of different stakeholders to be able to be teaching about amphibians and the value of biodiversity and wildlife, and then also sort of highlight the plight of amphibians in that particular region. In the tropics especially, there's very high abundance of amphibians and diversity of amphibians, but that has changed as a result of some diseases. So that's what we try to communicate to a wide range of people in that part of the world.
Definitely. And I love that you're really getting out there in different communities and inspiring some young kids, maybe getting them excited to pursue science themselves. But I'm curious to hear about where your journey first started. Jamie, is there maybe a memory or a particular moment you can think of when you first started getting interested in science?
Well, I was very lucky to grow up in a very scientific household. My parents are both scientists of a sort. They don't focus on wildlife, but they encouraged me to follow my interests. And when I was very, very young, I was actually pretty excited about space and becoming an astronaut. So I actually won a scholarship to attend space camp and got pretty excited about that. And for a long time, that's what I thought I would be when I grew up. And that changed as time progressed, and I got really excited about science here on planet Earth and the biology in particular of what's happening on planet Earth. And one adventure led to the next adventure, and I was always looking for opportunities to be out there. So when I was in an undergrad, that involved working with birds, and that led me to Argentina, where I was working with penguins and kinds of projects. There's one project up in Alaska with pigeon guillemots. And that then led me to work in amphibians when I was introduced to some very handsome toads that I was pretty excited about. And ultimately, that was what led me to my current research program. And it's just been one logical step to the next, following what I found particularly exciting.
Well, Jamie, I don't know about our listeners out there, but I am very curious about these handsome toads. So can you tell us more?
Sure. So before I even started in my master's program at University of Colorado, I was volunteering in a lab that focused on amphibians. And that was back before we really knew about the disease that's wiping out amphibians. And we had a collection of boreal toads. And the toads were provided by a captive breeding program that was focusing on conservation and reintroduction efforts. And the truth is that I just was doing animal care and was totally besotted by these very handsome toads. So that's how I got excited about amphibians, was just the love of a toad.
Very cool. And I think you took an interesting path, or sort of have an interesting mix of different sciences in your background. And you went from your master's degree at the University of Colorado, Boulder, then all the way to the James Cook University in Australia for public health. And many people wouldn't see that as sort of a logical next step for the amphibian research you're doing. So can you talk a little bit about that decision and how you got there to Australia?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, it doesn't seem particularly logical until you make the connection that the scientists who were originally working on the disease chytridiomycosis, which is the disease that I've been working on since that time, it was actually discovered and described in Australia. This is a disease that has impacted amphibians all over the world. In every continent that has amphibians, we know that this disease has been pretty impactful. And the original scientists who described this way back in 1998, they had been studying the disappearance of amphibians within the tropical region of Australia. So by the time I was ready to pursue my doctoral degree, they had some of the best science on this particular disease. So it made a tremendous amount of sense for me to move over to Australia to pursue my doctoral degree.
Amazing. Well, I look forward to chatting more about some of your world travels as we go through our interview, but I'd love to chat a little bit next about some of the projects you're working on now. So, Jamie, do you have a favorite project in the works that you want to tell us more about today?
Well, I'm currently sort of have a mixed bag in my lab group. So my research group has a number of students, postdocs, undergrads, who all are interested in disease ecology. And we don't just limit that to amphibians. So we have projects that are getting up and going on bats, trying to understand white nose syndrome. And we also have a new project that we're really excited about, focusing on snails and some of the innate defensive mechanisms that snails have.
Cool.
So that is going to overlap with some work that a colleague of mine does on the Galapagos Islands. And we're just super thrilled about starting in on the terrestrial snails and looking at bats when they are getting ready for hibernation, and the microbes and pathogens that are associated with those organisms as well. So it's a pretty diverse group, and we are all pretty excited about all of these plans. Having said that, though, we still have a tremendous amount of work going on with the amphibians in a few different locations in Panama, as well as in the southwest of the United States and in California.
Awesome. So for our listeners out there who might not be as familiar with some of these things, can you talk a little bit about what is white nose syndrome in bats?
Sure. So white nose syndrome is a newly recognized disease of bats. It's caused by a fungal pathogen known as Pseudogymnoascus destructans. That's the scientific name for this fungal pathogen. And it is a pathogen that was introduced in the northeastern United States, and it has subsequently spread to bat populations both in the United States and in Canada. And it sort of progressed by transmitting from some bat colonies to others, moving west. So sort of a spread of disease moving from east to west across Canada and the United States. And unfortunately, it's been pretty devastating for bat populations, and that includes multiple bat species. So just really high levels of mortality for bats, and it's been difficult to respond to so far. We're actually very lucky because we learned a lot from the amphibian diseases that allow us to work with bat biologists to try and get ahead of all the problems that come up with infectious disease.
Gotcha. Well, Jamie, it sounds like you have an exciting variety of projects going on in the lab there. And you started chatting a little bit there at the end about some of the challenges and the problems. And I think these are so important to talk about in science. And I think there are many different types of challenges and failures and struggles that you encounter, but they're oftentimes not talked about much. So I love covering these on our show to give our listeners a realistic view of life as a scientist. So Jamie, do you have a favorite struggle or a failure or a really tough time that you went through that you can tell us about today?
In terms of the science, there are always struggles and challenges and pitfalls. So one of the major dilemmas when you're working on an infectious disease problem is that it can be incredibly difficult to do very robust and solid science when the animals that you're trying to study are dying or disappearing for unknown reasons. So that leads to a variety of different challenges in terms of trying to understand what exactly is happening in terms of pathogen virulence or host defenses, and where is that breaking down? Well, that's extremely hard to do when you don't have those animals available, and or if you can't obtain and isolate those particular pathogens. So that's the nature of the beast when you're working with infectious disease, but it creates a wide range of different challenges that come up, especially when you're working in areas that maybe don't have all the infrastructure or resources that scientists usually use. So just to provide an example, we do a lot of work in Panama, and one of the keys to our most recent research is that we needed to be able to isolate the pathogen, but we were basically working in the jungle in very remote locations. So what that meant was that we needed to transport laboratory equipment and supplies into very remote locations. So this created some really funny pictures when we were essentially taking liquid nitrogen dewars up into the jungle on horseback.
Oh, wow.
And we were also trying to do sterile technique and microbiology using kerosene lanterns because we didn't have a great way to sterilize the supplies that we were working with for pathogen isolation. So I lovingly referred to this as caveman culturing because we didn't have a scientific laboratory to work in, but it was a heck of a lot of fun. And ultimately, we were fortunately successful in isolating the pathogen and getting the samples that we needed frozen from far off mountain tropical areas.
Definitely. And Jamie, I think the story you told really highlights some of the resourcefulness and ingenuity and creativity that you need as a scientist to brainstorm through how to deal with some of these problems.
Yeah, I think that's really the winning ticket, is being able to look at a set of circumstances and find a way to work through to get the samples or the data that you need for the question that you're trying to answer.
Definitely. I love it. Well, Jamie, great to hear about some of the challenges that you face in your daily work, but I'd love to also hear about some of the great things, some of the successes that you've experienced. So do you have a favorite success story to share, whether it was a big win or even just a small one that really meant a lot to you?
Yeah, one of my biggest and most profound moments was when my colleague and I were basically working on amphibians in Panama when they started to disappear. And we anticipated that the disease would spread into that area, but it was sort of really happened very fast. And we were appalled that so quickly the animals disappeared that we were working with. And we basically had to go on with our studies and didn't return to Panama for quite a while. And when we finally did go back, we were disheartened to find that we really were having a hard time finding the species that we were looking for. Just to give you one example, there's a frog known as the golden frog of Panama. And this is a species that is bright canary yellow with black tiger stripes across its back. And they're really spectacular. And at one time, you could find them in really high numbers. So if you're walking along a stream, it'd be hard to walk without stepping on them. There were so many of them.
Oh, wow.
And then subsequent to the emergence of the disease, we couldn't find any. And basically, the rumor was that they had gone extinct. So when we returned to Panama, there was basically no expectation that we would actually find any of these frogs. Well, it was probably 2 months in after searching all of our former sites when we finally found one frog alive and perfectly happy. And that was just the moment of explosive excitement because basically what it indicated to us is that some of them had survived and they were there and they were doing okay. And we knew that that was an opportunity for exploring all kinds of questions in terms of how did these frogs survive, even though they were infected with a pathogen? What does that mean for the disease dynamics and the host pathogen interactions? And what did it mean for the environment that they were trying to recover in? So that really made a whole lot of science possible just from the effort to go back out there and find the frogs in areas where they were thought to be extinct.
That is amazing, Jamie. And I imagine this involves hours of searching through the jungle, which is not the perhaps most pleasant of environments to be drudging through.
Oh, no, lots of bug bites.
I imagine. So how did you keep motivated to keep searching when you were really struggling to find these frogs? What kept you from throwing in the towel and saying there aren't any?
To be honest, it was close.
Yeah.
But I do think that at the time there was an incredibly enthusiastic team that we had cobbled together that really loved amphibians so much that it was worth it to stay out in the rain and to keep slogging through the mud and to be uncomfortable in an effort to find these animals. And to be honest, like that is still the case every time we go back down there. It's hard work. It takes a whole lot of effort. And they still have not recovered completely. So sometimes we go out and we don't find a lot, and that's disheartening. So I think that the thing that keeps us going is an understanding of what it used to be and how important the diversity is, especially within the tropics. So that's part of the story and the reason why we keep going, and an important one.
Definitely. So Jamie, I have to ask, how did you celebrate when you finally found this one beautiful golden frog?
We took a zillion photographs.
Yeah.
Lots and lots of pictures. And ultimately, we left the frog to go on. And the pictures we took back with us and we posted on our walls as a source of inspiration to keep going. And that has been a remarkable outcome of the research.
Certainly. Well, congratulations on the success. And I'm glad you found that frog.
Yeah.
And I'd love to chat a little bit more, diving back outside of the science for a moment about what you're reading, Jamie. So do you have a favorite book maybe that you've read or one that you're currently reading that you want to recommend to me and our listeners?
Well, I do love to read. Most recently, I guess I read a book called On Immunity, which I found to be a really remarkable read. I teach immunology, and a lot of times I struggle to talk with students about the importance of immunizations and how that operates for the immune system. And the book On Immunity is not written by a scientist. It's actually written by a very poetic author who wanted to understand immunity for raising her own children. And that was a read that I really enjoyed because it informed some of the conversations I have with my students who are interested in immunology and host defenses in general, but in particular, what it means for today's world that includes a lot of anti-vaccination sentiment and what that means for the health of our communities and even just our students here at the university.
Excellent. Well, I've not heard of this before, so I'm going to have to add it to my own reading list as well as to the one on our website. And you mentioned you like to read a lot. Are you typically gravitating towards these sciencey books?
I do have to read a lot for my work in general, and that usually involves reading a lot of scientific papers as well as editing a lot of scientific papers. So if I'm picking up a book on the side, I do enjoy fiction and some things that are, I would say, outside of my field of study that I find very refreshing as well.
Awesome. Well, Jamie, great to chat a little bit about what you're reading these days. And we've talked a little bit throughout our conversation about some of the wonderful places that you've been able to go for your science. But I think every scientist has that dream place, that favorite place that they've been to. So I have to ask, what's yours?
One of my great opportunities as a scientist when I was in Australia was to work for the state of Tasmania, where there is a tremendous amount of work on island biology that includes a wide range of different animals. And I tagged along on a trip that went to Christmas Island, which is famous for the Christmas Island red crabs, as well as the very large robber or coconut crabs, which I was just absolutely thrilled to have the opportunity to be there and run around catching crabs. I was helping out with somebody else's work. It wasn't my own research, but I just found it so enjoyable. There are these enormous coconut crabs that could be up to, 4 kilos bigger than house cats.
Right.
The funniest thing was that they could climb trees. So you had these enormous crabs that would hang out in the trees, and they move very slowly, but they're curious, and they would come up and explore your backpack and maybe try to take your peanut butter sandwich. And
oh my goodness,
that was just a tremendous amount of fun. Yeah, the diversity of crabs on Christmas Island is really something magical.
Yeah. Are they hard to catch?
No, not the coconut crabs. They're very slow. Very strong, but not particularly fast. The red crabs are a little bit quicker. And then you have these crabs called ghost crabs, which are quite fast, and they scurry out in the tide. So they have this ability to sort of shimmy themselves down into the sand very quickly. So you kind of only catch glimpses of them, and that's why they call them ghost crabs.
Well, that sounds like an amazing experience. You're making me really want to go and spend some time with these crabs.
It's a little off the beaten path, but once you get there, it's really a remarkable place.
Yeah, and I know you spent quite a bit of time in Australia for your PhD work as well as some of these other research projects. So can you talk a little bit about what it was like being able to work there?
For a biologist, it's an absolute paradise. The wildlife is just hard to talk about. You have your charismatic species, the koala and the kangaroos and the big brown snakes, but there are just books that are packed with so many marsupials that you've never heard of, names that sound delightfully unfamiliar, like betong and potaroos, and all of these animals that you didn't even imagine existed. So it's quite fun just for the variety of wildlife that's there. And then, of course, in addition, being in Australia is fantastic for the Australian people as well. So it was quite a great experience. I spent a lot of time on the island of Tasmania, which feels like a home away from home at this point in time.
Definitely. And I know you've been able to travel probably, I imagine, quite a bit for fun as well. So do you have a favorite fun travel destination?
One of my favorite trips was to the island of Palau, which is in the South Pacific. On that particular trip, I was lucky enough to be with my husband, who grew up on the Pacific island of Guam, and some of his old high school buddies were on the island of Palau, and one of them happens to be the son of the Queen of Palau. So we had an opportunity to explore the set of islands with the Queen of Palau and to do some pretty remarkable things. You may have heard of Jellyfish Lake.
Yeah,
which is a lake that contains lots and lots of jellyfish that have lost their stinging characteristics. So swimming in fresh water with jellyfish, which is quite remarkable. And it's one of the first places that's created a shark sanctuary. So for that reason, the marine life is just remarkable. And a lot of people fly to Palau just for experiencing that. And that was really a very fun trip. For a variety of reasons, Palau is a very, very special place.
Definitely. Well, it sounds absolutely amazing. So listeners, we'll have to put this on our bucket list, I think.
Yeah, do that. It's remarkable.
Phenomenal. So, Jamie, it sounds like through your research and through your travel, you've been able to encounter so many wonderful people as well. And I think this is one of the great aspects of careers in science. You get to work with so many amazing, funny, remarkable individuals. And I think this goes contrary to the stereotypes of the way that people think about scientists oftentimes. So I love talking on our program about maybe some of the fun memories and some of the fun traditions that scientists have that really goes contrary to these stereotypes out there in the media and show this human side of science. So, Jamie, do you have a story of your own of a fun or funny encounter that you've had with colleagues that you can share with us today?
Well, I have to say that we generally have goofy shenanigans that happen in the field without a doubt. So I have some people that I work with in Panama, for example, that are just a barrel of laughs. And I always look forward to hanging out with them just because you never know what's going to come out of their mouth. But if I think about scientists doing quirky things that are sort of fun and for the goofiness of it, I think about lab groups that have Christmas ornament competitions, making stuff out of lab supplies and that sort of thing. So on any given day, you can head into the lab and see a variety of odd creatures that have been constructed with plastics that are no longer needed, or funny pipettes that have been bent in a certain way. And just to apply your imagination to what is normally viewed as the drudgery of sitting at the bench and doing science. But most scientists somewhere down deep have a very quirky sense of humor. And when it bubbles up to the top, it can be pretty entertaining and funny to interact with people.
So, Jamie, within your own lab, do you have these sort of lab Christmas ornament competitions or anything like that?
We recently had a lab meeting where we had a competition for decorating the ethanol bottles.
Oh.
So around my lab, we have a variety of ethanol bottles for spraying down the countertops. And that's just sort of chore that is not particularly fun or exciting. So during one of our recent lab meetings, we had a competition for decorating the ethanol bottles with stickers and permanent markers and those sorts of things. And now they are distributed around the lab, lovingly, of course, because now everyone is a little bit more happy when they have to go through the chore of cleaning off the benches.
Awesome. So who was the winner?
I think the winner was my student, Alexa. She was particularly creative with taking bits of different parts of stickers and creating a new little design on the ethanol bottle itself.
I like it. Little Franken-sticker action there. That's great.
Yeah. No spray bottle should be without some sort of funky sticker.
Well, Jamie, wonderful to hear more about some of the fun and funny things that you and your colleagues do when you're together. And I think these are really important for just kind of having a pleasant and great work environment. Like you said, making some of those mundane chores a little bit more exciting to do every day. And I know in the work that you're doing, you're answering some amazing questions. And there's often something standing in the way, whether it's a limit in time, in funding, in feasibility, and being able to find the organisms you're trying to study, whatever it may be. So Jamie, if I took away all of the normal barriers and gave you everything you needed, what is the one question you most want to answer?
I'm really interested in understanding how disease dynamics shift over time. So I'm fascinated by the interactions between hosts and pathogens. And I'm really interested in understanding how you go from having a severe disease epidemic, so sort of this peak of the spread as well as the severity of a particular infectious disease. How does that subside? Because typically that changes with time such that hosts and pathogens can coexist without having the severely high levels of mortality or the manifestations of the disease. So I'm really interested in understanding that biology of the pathogen and the biology of the host and how those two things come together such that the disease dynamics change and allow persistence. I think that's really the key to understanding what's going to continue to happen in our increasingly globalized world. So we have seen a tremendous rise in the number of emerging infectious diseases. This problem is not going to go away. And it's not only a problem for humans as they move around the planet in air travel, but it's also a problem for wildlife. And I think that these kinds of problems, there are going to be more of them. And the complexities of them, I find particularly intriguing. So if we can understand how the disease operates on a mechanistic level, then maybe we can, in some cases, be able to mitigate some of the threats to wildlife and really get into the heart of what is going on in these infectious disease outbreaks.
Definitely. Well, this is a really interesting question, Jamie, in terms of how or why epidemics stop. And I suspect the answer to my next question involves a lot of different things. But from your perspective, what really makes this question difficult to solve?
Well, as I mentioned before, frequently when you have an emerging infectious disease that's highly lethal, you tend to have a loss of the wildlife within that area. And that makes it very difficult to work on that particular problem. There's a variety of other things that can create challenges, everything from the safety to the researchers themselves. So depending on the disease system, that can be a problem. Working on something, for example, like hantavirus or plague or something along those lines, that in and of itself creates an enormous challenge. In my case, we're working with pathogens that do not infect humans, so that is less of a challenge. But you still have to be hyper aware of potentially introducing a microscopic pathogen that you can't see into a naive population. So there's a tremendous amount of forethought that has to go into our project planning and our what we call field hygiene in order to keep those pathogens contained and yet still get high quality scientific data. So it does take a tremendous amount of planning and a tremendous amount of awareness about the organisms that you're trying to study.
Absolutely. I think you brought up some really good points, and you've given me and our listeners some food for thought today. So thank you, Jamie. One last thing I'd like to ask you for, and that is some advice. I think throughout our careers as scientists, we get so much good advice from a variety of different people. Is there one piece of advice that someone gave you that really had a big impact?
Very simply, never give up. I think that one of the keys to being successful in science is just perseverance. It's just dogged determination and following what the data tell you. Sometimes it leads you to a far more interesting place than you would arrive at otherwise. So being determined, even when it seems like a particular experiment has failed, sometimes those are really moments of insight, and it just depends on how you approach the particular quote unquote problem, being determined to find something within that effort. Typically, you actually discover that there is more there than meets the eye.
Well, excellent advice for our listeners, Jamie. Is there any last message you want to leave them with today at the end of our interview?
Science is fun. I could not ask for a better way to spend my life and my career.
Well, that is a wonderful note to end on today, Jamie. If our listeners are intrigued by your science and want to learn more, where should they go or how should they get in touch?
You can certainly get in touch through my webpage, which if you just Google Jamie Voyles, it should pop up as either a link through the university or you may just stumble upon our direct link to our webpage. You can also find me on Twitter, and we have a Facebook page for our lab group as well.
Phenomenal. Well, listeners, definitely check out those resources. Get in touch with Jamie if you have any questions. And Jamie, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. It was very fun.
Oh, well, this has been a pleasure. And listeners, great to have you here with us as well. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science.